In the state of Maine, we grow the two most valuable agricultural commodities on a per acre basis. I mean, potatoes is about $300 an acre, blueberries is maybe $1,000 to $2,000 an acre, shellfish is about $20,000 an acre, and it can be higher than that depending on what the production is. Finfish is about $100,000 an acre.
We can grow this stuff without any freshwater, arable land, or fertilizer. And if you look at some of the challenges to the environment, it's lack of fresh water, it's too much fertilizer, and the arable land is being taken up by other uses.
And then you have runoff, which is, of course, creating huge problems in the oceans and gulfs of the world. We don't have that problem. We're actually part of the solution.
In our lifetimes, by mid-century, the world is going to have reached peak population between, 9-10 billion people from the 7 we have now. But more importantly, the increased affluence that people will have, and also the urbanization, moving to cities. 70% of the people are going to live in cities by 2050. The amount of seafood needed is going to be double what we have now. So I think the crucial dilemma in our lifetimes is going to be, can we feed these people without ruining the environment? That's it.
Aquaculture is a very interesting and dynamic field right now. It's very clear that in a global sense, we are not going to feed the world just from the land. We're running out of arable land, we're running out of fresh water, we're running out of nutrients to fertilize plants. Land animal production is relatively inefficient compared to production in the water.
If we're looking at feeding the world protein, there's no question that aquaculture's got to be a part of that mix, and probably the most important part of the mix going forward. Wild-caught fisheries have leveled out in the last 10 years, so the increase is going to come from aquaculture. And I think Maine is a great example of an area that's learned lessons about how to do it right and have learned from some mistakes in the past. And we're starting to figure out how to produce low-impact, sustainable protein in a way that appreciates the conservation issues within the ocean, but also allows us to feed a growing population. We felt like there were a lot of people that needed to learn about the experience in Maine and what was happening here.
So that was the genesis for this tour, to try and get environmentalists, farmers, and regulators and environmental monitoring folks all together in a more casual setting. Take them out on the farm, have them meet the farmers directly, and allow them, get them to ask those questions directly to the farmers, so that they began to understand a little bit about the farmers' world, and the farmers began to understand about the environmental community's world and the regulators' world. So the tour started in Portland. We went down to the waterfront and went to visit the kelp hatchery that's located at the Gulf of Maine Research Institute.
So this is, the kelp goes to
Ocean Approved is the only seaweed farming company in the United States. It's owned by two gentlemen, Paul Dobbins and Tolaf Olson.
Our kelp culture in this country died away, but if you look at other countries where there isn't a lot of arable land and a high population density, you see a very strong kelp culture. In Japan, 11% of their caloric intake comes from kelp. That's dropping.
Ned Daly was really one of the key people in the tour. He comes from Seafood Choices. It's a group that has really pioneered the linkage between environmental concerns and the buyer communities. Dave Alves is the regional coordinator for NOAA Fisheries for aquaculture. Alan Brigham worked for the U.S. Economic Development Authority for the Department of Commerce. Lorenzo Juarez is the deputy director of the aquaculture program at NOAA Fisheries. Mike Epling works for the New England Aquarium. The New England Aquarium has a program where they literally go out to farms and assess farms from an environmental point of view for buyers, like they hold.
But it is enjoyable.
Disney called. They heard about our kelp farm. They were filming Pirates of the Caribbean 4 in Hawaii. They called us up and said, send us samples quick. And so we rallied, got out to the farm, got some samples to them. They got them, they draped Johnny Depp in the kelp and they took pictures. They said, it looks fabulous. We need, 600 full plants tomorrow by noon. And we said, we can get you the 600 plants, but because of the way FedEx works, you won't get it. You're out in Hawaii until 4. And there was this long pause, and I said, we can't do that. We're going to have to use plastic, but we'll come back to you again. And subsequent to then, they've actually referred us to a lot of studios because of the sustainable nature in the way that we're going about our kelp. They want to be associated with that.
So what we have here, we have these two parallel lines. These are long lines, about 1,500 feet long. They're set up so that they're 7 feet exactly below the surface of the water, and each one, once it's seeded out, will have between 60 and 90,000 kelp plants. It's a very efficient way to grow kelp.
When we're growing it, we actually harvest it, and what we work with is we want the clear kelp. You can see we have large sections of the really flat, clear kelp. That'll make it's a beautiful vegetable.
Different piece.
Mike Rust is the NOAA Aquaculture Office Science Coordinator. He wanted to come to Maine to see how our aquaculture sector was kind of growing and developing and the relationship between that and the research and development infrastructure we have here. Julie Mounds was from the Smithsonian Institution. Ken Stump was a fascinating member of the tour. He has been an environmental activist and campaigner for many, many years.
Well, there are some major concerns in the environmental community. There were big concerns about the supply of fish meal and oil from wild fish to supply the feedstocks to feed these farmed carnivorous fish like salmon. That's a big issue. I think disease transmission is a big challenge to the aquaculture industry.
Ken and I would be people who traditionally would find ourselves on very opposite sides of the table, representing interests, negotiating very hard over policy issues, and we actually, I think, came to respect each other. It was an interesting evolution over the time of the tour. So from Portland, we drove up to Damariscotta, a little town on the coast of Maine, about an hour north of Portland, and went to go have dinner at the Damariscotta Grill. And at that dinner, we had John Lewis from the Department of Marine Resources come and meet members of the tour and talk to them about the environmental monitoring program that the state does.
One thing I have to be very careful of in the hearings is not to choose sides, not to present myself as an advocate, even though I think it might be a good idea. The state is probably the one entity that people look to for some unbiased opinion.
The dinners were really interesting, and I often find myself talking with Ken, and we started off, I think, in a very traditional environmentalist, farmer kind of posturing with each other.
I recognize that particularly in the environmental community, people view me in a certain way. And frankly, for me personally, that's very frustrating because I've been in this business for 35 years, and I never, at any point in my career, ever wanted to do any harm to anybody.
And for a long time, I always thought of aquaculture, particularly the sort of offshore version of it, as being, something of a dystopian vision of the future. But I've learned to think of it in terms of diversification, coastal economies, and you're showing us some really stellar examples of people who are being very innovative, and potentially creating potential for a whole new industry. It is really impressive, and I think we should find ways to support that.
The following morning we got up and then went out on the river to visit some of the oyster farms on the Damariscotta. We went out with Dana Morse, who's a local Sea Grant Extension agent, Chris Davis, who owns a company called Pemaquid Oyster Company,
late 1700s, early 1800s, the oysters started to die out in the estuary. When we started to look 25 years ago, when we were looking at reintroducing eastern oysters to farm them, we didn't have any native population. We ended up going to stocks south of us to bring in the oyster for culture purposes. So we've been cultivating these for 25 years now. Started out, I think, 2 farms, and then there were 2 of us, and then now there are about 8 commercial farms.
So yeah,
You're from the government. I've heard that before. No. So our farm is kind of a 4-step process. We buy seed from a hatchery when it's about 1 to 2 millimeters in size, and we grow it in upwellers that are at the dock at the marina, and then bring the seed down here to the nursery, where it gets put out in small mesh bags at a certain density. That after it grows for a while, we take them out of those bags, run them through the grading machine, and put them back at a different density in a larger mesh bag.
Our whole strategy has been to grow oysters the first year in a floating nursery, and then second and sometimes third year growing on bottom on the growing beds. So once they leave these the cages, there's no longer any protection whatsoever. We're literally just throwing them off the boat onto the bottom. The biggest threat I see on the horizon actually is if this FDA requirement for post-harvest processing goes through, we'll be out of, everyone in Maine will be out of business. 2 bacteria, Vibrio bacteria, which are naturally occurring bacteria in the marine environment, they're everywhere. But particularly in the Gulf Coast, in the summertime, because the water temperatures are so warm, and then oysters get hauled out and put on the deck of the boat, and it's 95 degrees, and they sit for 6 hours before they get put into a cooler, the Vibrio can multiply inside the shell and can make people sick, particularly if you're immunocompromised. FDA is concerned about it and is proposing post-harvest processing, which would kill the bacteria.
But it kills the oyster.
It kills the oyster. Yeah. So you no longer have a half-shell market. Some of the ways it cost $1 million just for the machine to do the high-pressure treatment. I mean, it's not going to work for small growers. It tends to swap the water around.
And I'm very encouraged, I think, of what I've seen here in Maine. I think one of the things that I perhaps didn't anticipate is that the regulatory framework probably makes operations a challenge, particularly for small operators, and so I would assume that one of the needs from the industry's perspective here is to looking at how to streamline that, not compromising the environment, but making sure that business can work in a way that's also sustainable.
So we then moved on to see a shellfish hatchery. Tony Simmons from Muscongas Bay Aquaculture was very kind and gave us a tour through her hatchery. It's one of the most modern hatcheries we have in the state.
Predominantly our customer base comes from other farmers, such as ourselves, from Canada to Florida, who buy our seed from the hatchery in a variety of sizes. There's no heat source for these.
So after visiting Tony Simmons at the hatchery, we all piled in the van again and drove up to Ellsworth. One of the challenges of the tour was that Maine is a big state, and there's a lot of territory to cover, and it takes a lot of time. So the following morning we got up early and went out to visit Fiona and Theo de Konig's mussel farm. Theo and Fiona's mussel operation is a traditional European style bottom culture mussel farm, and we watched them seed out one of their lease sites.
This is an enhanced natural process that needs a vessel, that's all.
This looks suspiciously like agriculture, like
it is.
Tractor and
it's very similar. That's what I usually explain it as potato or carrot farming. I mean, it's a simple idea, but of course the devil's in the detail. There's a lot of experience needed, but he's been doing it all his life. So there's a big pump and they add water in, and there are gates in the side of the hold, and we broadcast it, and he'll just move around over the lease. And that's where the skill of the farmer comes in, because you have to do that taking into account the tide, and you've got to get them evenly. This is actually relatively less labour intensive than on rope. Plus also, there's a lease there. Nobody has any problem with it. So people in Maine are more tolerant if there's not too much visual impact. What we try to do is resolve any issues on land. The worst thing you can possibly do is have competition on the water for resource, and that's what we've learned from the Netherlands too. You need to deal with these issues, and there may be conservation issues, there may be clam issues, worming issues, or something else. So, and it's complicated and not always easy to find the right people to talk with. To be honest, I would say I've learnt by the mistakes that were made in those situations in the Netherlands. The aquaculture community wasn't really very compromising with the enviro groups, and in fact that was something that built up some polarization, and since we're the first ones here, we would like to do it differently. So we put a lot of work into community outreach. In fact, I'm part of the a Frenchman Bay partnership, which we're trying to develop a management plan for this area anyway. That's nothing to do with state or anything else. It's a separate conservation group. And that's where it's a lot of education, where people think it's either conservation or industry, and it's not. Anybody who wants to work within a marine environment, is in our best interest to maintain the ecology as well.
I think one of the major things that's jumped out to me is the people, the farmers, in terms of their diversity, their backgrounds. It seems they have to be part scientist, part farmer, part mechanical engineer. They all seem to be incredibly energetic, enthusiastic, and that they truly love what they do.
We moved on to Great Bay Aquaculture of Maine, which was the cod farm. This is the first cod farm in America. Relatively small farm, early on in its startup phase. We met Clayton Coffin, who was the farm manager there.
I would argue in the state of Maine we have some of the highest fish health regulations in the world. On a farm site like this, twice a year, the state comes and they take samples both from directly underneath the farm, and then from away from the farm. In addition to that, the state sends people out here to look at the health of the animals on the farm, as well as Clayton contracts with a private vet who comes out and monitors the fish as well.
One of the biggest surprises for Ken was that as a farmer, we are often advocating for increased regulation because it's a way of ensuring the fact that we don't have farmers that are operating irresponsibly and impacting our own operations.
Before any fish come to this site, they have to come from what's called a certified facility, which is a hatchery. That hatchery has to have 3 years of health tests that are clean. So it's a very, there are multiple layers of control and monitoring involved here. And from the producer's point of view, does that make it uncomfortable sometimes? Absolutely. But on average, it seems to be a system that works.
The source for all of these fish is from the hatcheries.
Correct.
How many hatcheries are supplying?
There's one hatchery in New Hampshire, and there's one hatchery that we'll see later today over at the University of Maine.
So we continued on that day to the USDA National Coldwater Marine Aquaculture Research Station at Franklin, Maine. That facility is the facility that is responsible for the National Salmon Breeding Program, designed to improve the strains of Atlantic salmon that are grown on the farms. So we then went from the USDA facility to the University of Maine Center for Cooperative Aquaculture Research under the direction of Dr. Nick Brown. Dr. Brown gave us a tour around his facility, and that facility focuses on a number of different species, cod and halibut being the 2 marine finfish species they focus on.
The CCAR is an applied R&D facility for aquaculture. So it's a mixture of a place that can do research and a place that incubates businesses that are interested in developing their products or processes in Maine.
Well, I've been to Maine a few times, and I've actually worked with the guys at CCAR, off and on. And I will say that Maine is right up there at the cutting edge. They're doing some neat things, and it is definitely a good place to keep an eye on.
So the next morning we piled into the van again and drove all the way up into Eastport, Maine, the heart of Washington County, down East Maine. Washington County is the 5th poorest county in the United States. Relatively low population base, very little economic activity, most people are really scraping by. Aquaculture has proved to be a real game changer for Washington County. So the salmon farm we went to visit was a site that's actually been in operation for 30 years in the state of Maine. It's one of the oldest salmon farm sites we have in the state.
This cage has approximately 30,000 pre-market fish in it.
Spoke to Dave Morang from Cook Aquaculture, Nell Halse, who works for Cook as well and is very involved in community relations.
The Cook company is a fully integrated company, and that's been a strategy from day one. So we have our own hatcheries, our own farms, our own plants, our own feed mill. So there are a lot of in-house feed specialists who have a lot of experience with developing feed recipes and that sort of thing.
It seems like the operations are very efficient. They're looking at all the issues that we in the conservation community are concerned with. I think we feel like often producers are trying to get around those issues or obfuscate discussions about those issues, and that just doesn't seem to be the case. There really seems to be a lot of attention and focus on how to produce better, more sustainable product.
And this will tell him how much feed's in the silos and how much feed has gone into the fish. So aquaculture's come a long ways. There used to be a guy with a scoop. Now everything's monitored. The feeder has a better life, as you can see. Like in 2005, we almost lost the whole industry, And aquaculture is really important to this area. Second largest employer, the pulp mill in Woodland's the largest, and then would be Cook Aquaculture. Yep. It would be devastating if something, ever happened.
And we always have issues and challenges that we have to overcome to keep the production. Yeah. One of our challenges now is in order to treat for a naturally occurring parasite, sea lice, we have been using well boats so that we can pump the fish into the hold and use hydrogen peroxide, which is a benign product, to get rid of the lice. And but in order to get well boats to go back and forth, we have border issues, Jones Act. So we get permits for 100 days, and I'm sure you're familiar with this whole issue. But here we are about to stock this area after this is fallowed next spring. But this area tends to have warmer water, and we know we're going to have right tools in place to be able to manage sea lice. If we don't have any tools, we may decide not to put fish here. And what does that do for the people here? Dave's got people now who are driving down to Eastport every day to work because these sites are fallow. But if we don't put fish, but they're waiting to come back.
They want to come back. I've got 15 to 20 people down there right now that are driving because jobs are so scarce here.
So the processing plant in Eastport was the first fish processing plant to be opened in the state of Maine in the last 10 years, and employs quite a few people on any given shift, between 80 and 100 people.
I'm sure you get this question so many times, but how many fish do you do a day?
3,000, 3,500.
So not bad. And up to what size can you handle?
Anything from 4 pounds, like 4 to 6s, all the way up to like 12 to 15s.
That was kind of a nice way to wrap up the tour, because we started with relatively small farms operating individually, and ended up in a larger farm that included its own processing facility, employing a lot of people in down east rural Maine. The tour did a number of things, but most importantly, it established personal connections between groups and entities that would often have not developed those connections.
The stereotype of the big industrial factory farms is out there in the public's imagination, but this is a real opportunity to see what it looks like on the ground, and quite frankly, it looks a lot different here in Maine. You know, we got a chance to see the industry struggling with how to deal with those issues as well. And I think the important thing for me is to recognize that these are equally important issues and concerns to them, and they recognize the need to address public concern.
We deal with the NGO community as an abstract thing. We hear, they say this, we read these things, and you don't know the personalities. It really helps to know the person you're dealing with, that those personal connections help a lot.
So as we go forward and the discussion continues about aquaculture policy at a national level, we as a group have an ability to pick up the phone and talk to each other about very specific issues. Having had a common experience, having seen farms together, having talked to farmers directly. If we hadn't had that tour, if we hadn't spent that time together, we would be back in our traditional silos, negotiating across tables, and not necessarily getting as far along in that discussion and that debate as we will otherwise. Not to say we won't have our differences, not to say that we won't feel the need to make points about issues from a different perspective, but we have an area of commonality that we would not have had if we had not done the tour.